Hello there, everyone, and welcome to another edition of teissTalk with me, your host, Jenny Radcliffe. We've got a great show for you today, talking all about insider threat, onboarding, and how that's really been affected by the pandemic. What do we need to change in our protocols? Hi, Christian. What we need, live TV, as it were, folks. What we need to change in our protocols for the offboarding process after our working from home model has become en masse so suddenly. So I'm joined by a great panel. We just got a little glimpse. Later, I'll be joined by the lovely Christian Toon, who is the CISO for Pinsett Masons, and Neir Schiavone, who is head of data security at booking.com. But first, I'd like to welcome my first guest, James Hammond, who is the Chief Information Security Officer from the Financial Ombudsman. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Jenny. Good to be here.
Hey, James, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad. How are you doing?
I'm good. Just letting everyone know the panel is chucking around a little bit today, guys. So hopefully we'll have no more interruptions or anything else. It's all cool. James, crazy year. How have things been at the Ombudsman this year?
Yeah, wow. Who expected this one? It's been a challenging time. It's obviously reacting to a worldwide pandemic. I was saying to someone the other day, actually, I've been involved in business continuity as well as information security for a long time. And I was writing pandemic plans about 20 years ago, but I've never ever thought I'd ever have to use one.
Really? Did you think when you were writing them back in the day that this is sort of like a similar thing to, I don't know, being hit by a commas or something? I mean, was it just something you had to do, but you didn't think?
I think we thought science would prevail, but it would never get to the point where actually we had to all stay at home and workplaces were to shut. Science would provide us with a solution and everything would carry on as normal. But here we are.
Dreamer, James. Science and common sense was required, mate. That's what I think was. There seems to be a bit of a lack of it. What was it like changing everyone to the remote working models? Did you do it real quickly, or how were you already set up for that, or how did it work?
We weren't typically a working from home organisation. We had some people that could, and we had a corporate capability, and we were looking to expand that. So for us, we were lucky. We'd done the design from an architectural perspective. We had a corporately approved remote working solution, which came in 2 different formats. And we rapidly rolled it out. What was meant to have taken us probably a year and a half, we rolled out within a very short space of time. And I say lucky because we'd done the design up front. We didn't have to do any sort of knee-jerk reactions. We didn't have to change our risk appetite. We persisted with the design that we come up with, which meant from a security point of view, I think I got lucky to a certain degree in that I didn't have to go through those challenging decisions that possibly could have lowered our security posture. But it came with a whole bunch of other challenges as well, though. It wasn't just a case of rolling out this capability. Just getting our hands on equipment, laptops. We re-provisioned all of our desktops in our buildings, for example, so that they were actually offering remote working capabilities through our secure kind of front end. Literally, the desktops that were on people's desks were still being used, but we had a secure method for delivering those alongside our Citrix capabilities as well.
A secure method for delivery. I've got visions of you all like going into the office like on March the 24th or something last year, and kind of driving them in your car.
Do you know what? We kept them in the building. We actually our front end could be technical colleagues. I'm not going to take the credit for it, but our colleagues managed to deliver that processing power to drive remote desktops from the desktops that were literally under people's desks, so they were still there. It was an interesting time, actually. I was the one that pretty much lived closest to the office, so I was actually doing a lot of the work on behalf of colleagues. I'm not going to claim that I'm technical in the same capacity that they were. And it was interesting. We had a power cut one day, which actually took out quite a few of our home workers, which I never
indignity upon indignity.
Yeah, it was interesting. So it was interesting times, but there's lots of other challenges that went with that. So, people working from home, you lose control to a certain degree. Onboarding, for example, so you take on new staff. How do you actually get them to be in a position where they have the same knowledge and discipline as those that have been through our traditional onboarding methods, password guidance, for example. How do you actually roll it out in a way which the password etiquette actually lands as it would perhaps if you were delivering an induction face to face.
And what have you got advice on how to handle that for businesses? I mean, what sorts of things did you find was best practice for you guys?
So I think we rapidly looked at how our awareness was actually taken on board by new starters, for example, and by those working from home, what worked well, what didn't. And we basically landed a lot of our awareness material in different places. So we had a sort of a program of work that basically said, well, actually, where's this going to get the most visibility, and how do we complement our traditional sort of e-learning with things like virtual inductions, virtual talks. So, for example, if you're sending out a bunch of corporate laptops to users, you will typically have to send a guide with them for them to be able to access the device. So for us, we just we planted a bunch of good password tips and guidance within the first page, which says this is how you're going to get onto your device. When you do, you'll be forced to input your own password. Here are some tips about what to use, passphrases, 3 random words, links to the NCSC websites around what good passwords look like. And we found that worked actually, because they had to read it to actually get onto the device.
That's so clever. I mean, it's funny, isn't it, that I think throughout the pandemic and certainly through all the teissTalk interviews with our lead guests every week, I always ask them, what's it been like this last year? And it's funny, the little opportunities that came up, the wins really, that I suppose necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it?
Yes.
It's just, well, what can we do?
I mean, I did, I work closely with my comms team, and I'm lucky. I've got a very good sort of collaboration with them, and I sort of gave them the challenge of, here are some key points that I need to get out there. You're my friendly comms colleagues. Do it for me. Work out how to land this. Try and avoid the traditional stuff. Yeah.
Because I don't think, I mean, you say you're lucky, but I don't know whether it's luck so much or somebody having the will to really pass part of the awareness and the instruction to the experts, which are not us necessarily in the business.
That's it. And they came up with some brilliant ideas. They looked at where the material, what they were putting out there was actually accessed the most, and then embedded a bunch of the advice that I wanted to get out there as part of that. So it didn't necessarily fit directly, but we sort of created a segue to get it in there, and explain why it's important, and people were reading it.
That's just, I think that's a really lovely success story, really, that's come out of this. It just shows that we need to collaborate more, really.
I was going to say there's certainly a significant amount of collaboration between myself, our data protection officer, that team, risk team, IT teams, and we sort of we set the agenda slightly differently in terms of what we needed to achieve, and made sure that all the different stakeholders involved in that had their say. And it was almost like a challenge to each other. How do you support each other? Where traditional ideas might not actually be the right way to do it, and when everyone's suddenly working from home and they weren't used to it before. So collaboration is definitely part of the success that we had.
Now, we were speaking about onboards in there, and just before we get on to our news item, which is all about sort of onboarding and offboarding and everything that we're going to talk about, I do have to inform all of our viewers today that we do have something that you might want to take part in, because as you can see, I have no expense spared, a teissTalk mug, which is rather cool. And if you would like to ask some questions of our lovely panel today, so we've got James here at the moment, and we'll be joined later by Christian and Nir. If you would like to ask some questions of them, we will pick the best question, and you will win yourself a teissTalk mug. James, can you barely stand for the excitement?
I'm struggling here. I'm struggling, Jenny.
They are uber super limited, folks. So we are up for any questions, thoughts and comments. Bring them in onto the chat, and we will select one and send it out to the right person a little bit later on. Just to say that our teissTalk elves don't even have mugs, as you can see, so they are strictly limited. So do get the questions in for our lovely panel on anything that we're talking about today, and we'll try and answer them during the show and select the best one for your free mug. So there we go. They have fulfilled contractual obligation to mention the mug. So, James, let's get on to our story. Now, I love this news story today, and I know it's a bit wicked of me, but it just brings up so much about insider threat. So today, our news story today, which will be flashed up any second by our elves, there you go, is about an insider threat. So we hear of one Salvatore Alla Rosa, who I've probably said that name wrong, who used to work in food concessions at the San Jose Earthquakes soccer stadium. All right. Recently has pleaded guilty to accessing a restricted password. This is 2 months after he'd been dismissed from his position, selling food concession stands at the stadium, resulted in all the handheld payment devices going offline in the middle of an important match, and over $250,000 worth in damages to his employer, his former employer. James, I mean, what a story.
Wow. Yes.
I mean, I was going to say to you, you know, there's this in itself, but where do you even begin to unpack?
I mean, the output of what happened is incredible. It was an individual that had limited access to what I suspect was considered to be a fairly low risk system or capability, and in reality, he saw a way by which a minor alteration by himself could actually have a massive impact. And I suspect because he was on the ground doing a job, he knew what this meant. And certainly the impact, I mean, you read it, there's significant things that happen off the back of this. You've just interrupted a match. You've got passionate supporters, you've got the teams, you've got the running of the stadium and everything that goes with it. And you're now telling those supporters, actually, we're not going to make your day as great as it's meant to be. And it was just one chap with a password to a system that, it's what
we say, social engineering. It only takes one. You only need one slip, one thing to go wrong. And as you say, the real issue was, yes, there's the monetary issue, which was huge, really, when you think about how much they lost. It was to do with having to kind of do sort of half price food to try and make up for it next time, and several other things. He knocked out. Am I right in saying he knocked out the handheld payment devices and the menu or something? It wasn't clear. I did look at a few articles that the concessions menu and the credit cards, I think.
Basically, I think, it just impacted on the actual system that was being used across all the different vendors to facilitate basically people getting food and drink on a day, which I know certainly if I'm at a match, that's kind of key to my enjoyment.
You need your pie.
That's it, right? Exactly.
Whatever the equivalent is in San Jose, I'm sure they're not eating pork pies or whatever at the match. Yeah. But
I mean, the thing is, the impact was persisted over a period as well. So it wasn't just on the day. It was basically then having to make it up to these supporters and basically say, well, actually, we're trying to say sorry, and here's some other things to try and facilitate that. And it was not just one impact. It persisted for a period of time. And it was significant.
I think they actually spoke about fans getting quite abusive as well, and it almost, I nearly said, it sort of turns into a ballroom blitz, really. The kind of impact it did ripple out. I'm going to bring in the rest of our panel in a second to talk about the rest of this as well, because I know that once we knew that we were talking insider threats and particularly this sort of offboarding process, it certainly peaked. I know Christian's been sharing a few articles and things on Twitter today. So maybe if we bring in our panel, and I'd just like to welcome again Christian Toon, who is the Chief Information Security Officer at Pinsent Masons, and Nia Schiavone, who is Head of Data Security at Booking.com. And I'm just wondering, have we got Christian? There we go. Hey, Christian. Hi, Nia. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
So obviously you've been hearing me discussing this with James. I mean, Christian, initial thoughts on this one? Basic errors were made.
Well, yeah, you kind of think they should almost rewrite the article, though, to say that kind of organisation loses match day food and beverage sales because they've not managed their accounts and identities properly. I thought it was a bit kind of lazy journalism almost, that it's described as a hack, but actually the guy just logged in doing what he probably would have normally been able to do. It's just they didn't shut it down, and clearly they kind of felt the impacts of that.
Absolutely. Nia, what do you think? What were your initial thoughts on this one?
Well, first of all, I agree with Christian about the assumptions of, food and beverage companies might be a bit different than, let's say, financial services companies or similar. But more concretely, from risk perspective, I think that yes, there was a damage. No, it wasn't the most critical damage that you can think of, or even not the most common one. Because think about the same incident, but with data breach involved, with tons of information, both credit cards, personal data, and so on, that could change the let's say, the implication and the impact of this specific incident to be completely different, and also expanded to other jurisdictions in multiple countries. So in that regards, and we can discuss about the risk aspects later on in this interview or in this webinar, I think that it's also a matter of proportion to the business that needs to be taken into account.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the thing, James, wasn't it? It was, for that business, this is huge. But as Nia says, this could have been so much worse, really. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, it's, when you talk about any form of unauthorized access, typically you tend to think about those with privileged access, potentially to systems or to data from an administration point of view. But actually, at the same time, you've got to think about the reputational side of things as well. So social media, corporate social media, it scares me, to be honest. If a compromise were to take place of a social media account of a large organization, the damage that can be done through that can be massive. But typically the people that are in charge of those passwords or have access to those systems, they won't work in IT. They won't have that privileged access to the back end of systems. They're just a user at the front end. But the impact, you have to think about it like that. And as Nia suggests, it's about risk. You should always think about these from a risk perspective. What can actually happen?
Yeah, because I mean, as he says, if you're to be more technically capable, it may be, or more that way inclined, as Nia says, he could, next thing you know, with downloads and credit card details and personal information. But I mean, I wanted to come to Christian really, and I was thinking, Christian, motive was unsighted, but we can draw conclusions from this. He'd been dismissed 2 months earlier. And it just draws to mind. You posted today an article about this guy who took revenge. So Christian posted an article on Twitter not too long ago this afternoon of a guy who took revenge on his employer through. Do you want to explain it, Christian? Because you posted a great article.
Kind of wanting to come out with some kind of relevant sort of stories, I guess, in comparison, that kind of $240,000 is probably a drip in the ocean to what one Spanish automobile company had to fork out when a rogue employee, after recently being dismissed, stole a JCB, drove it 13 miles at 1 a.m. in the morning, which is a feat in itself, to crash into kind of the place where they store all the new cars and caused somewhere in the region of like $6 million worth of damage, dollars, to that organisation.
I couldn't believe it was $6 million, but he damaged 70 cars, right?
German-make manufacturers for you. But I think the issue it just highlights is that unpredictability of people. Yeah. That trust and integrity has to go so far, because you don't want to create a Orwellian kind of culture within your business that basically says we don't trust you. But then actually kind of, well, how do you try and mitigate this sort of stuff? Because I bet you the kind of food and beverage organization in California had not really thought about that as a threat profile, the same way Mercedes in Spain hadn't thought that one of their rogue employees would crash through all their physical protection with a massive JCB. So it's hard. And it's kind of, well, where do you draw the line? I think James mentioned around the risk. It's understanding that exposure, because you're not going to be able to deal with everything. At best, you would hope to be notified of when people are joining the organization, or indeed when they're leaving, and that you can put the right controls in around those processes. But yeah, some of the stories about other things that have gone on. Yeah, there was, I think, something in the water in California, because another one I picked up was the Cisco engineer that deleted 16,000 WebEx accounts, and it cost Cisco like £1.5 million to repair. $1 million in refunds and damages, and the guy's in prison for 2 years. So it's kind of it happens. I think
no one's a winner, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
At that point. But I want to say about this, just before I come to Nia for the comment here, is that I'm laughing a little bit, and I'm not laughing really because obviously it's a very serious thing. It's not funny when these things happen, but some of them, they do raise a smile at the ambition of the guy. And with Christian's tweet this afternoon, and our elves have put a little link to it there. There was a guy on Twitter who said, you know, he drove that JCB all that time and not once thought to himself, this is a bad idea. And like I said, no, he's thinking this is great because revenge, even though malicious insider breaches are quite a small proportion, according to a Tessian survey that we'll put up in a minute, it's still revenge is the big motivation nearly always for those things. And that's why I'm laughing. I'm not laughing because it's funny, obviously. We've got some great questions coming in. Keep them coming in, folks, so that we can, I'll get them a little bit later and we'll see who can win this mug. But Nia, I mean, this is a human problem as much as technology, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. But, you know, getting back to the risk part, and I will always get back to the risk part because I think way to conduct and to oversee, you know, and to put the focus on the right areas. So in the context of the human aspect, I would tie it directly to the probability aspect of the risk, which influences directly on the level of the risk. And that I can assume there are a couple of approaches for that. One approach could be, let's try to understand what is the unbased probability that I can predict for someone to do harm for the business for any reason. Another approach could be, I can assume that everyone could be mistrust, or I should suspect them, and therefore I can put controls on that in a way that wouldn't be maybe too intrusive or offensive, if you like you're showing in mistrust with your employees. There are ways to do that, such as dual control and other methods of detection that can provide some level of certainty that if someone would like to do harm for the business, they will get caught. So that would be another aspect. And another way to do that is maybe to try to use the awareness aspect. And by saying awareness, I know it sounds a bit naive because awareness, it's not for people which have a strong revenge emotion. But in that regards, enough awareness for the fact that we have enough controls in our organization that can either detect or even prevent these types of, let's say, misusages. And in that context, if that person would have enough awareness that before they will try to attempt any action or any harm for an organization, they will be aware of the consequences of that. And that type of awareness could be effective in some cases. So that would take on the human aspect.
James, would you agree with Nia there?
I do. I was also just thinking, sometimes actually working with the different areas, the different individuals, as you actually do your risk assessment is actually quite beneficial. Certainly one of the things that we do is to actually sort of, as part of our risk framework, maintaining our risk registers, talk about insider threat. You have to be careful who you talk about this with in case you give people ideas, but you know, explore what the worst thing that can happen is. So, you know, sort of, I would imagine in the case of the food stall vendor, you know, if there was a risk session around understanding the impact of any unavailability of that particular system, you would have highlighted the risk around ensuring, you know, proper account management, etc., all that sort of stuff. And if you were to do that across an organisation, I mean, some of the stuff I've heard from different areas is absolutely brilliant. You know, if someone wanted to disrupt some organisations, there are lots of different ways you can do it, but as an individual, we might not actually think about that. So, you know, that constant risk monitoring and evaluation is very beneficial.
Yeah, I really agree, and I think, you know, we can open this up a little bit now to sort of the general topic. I think of more like offboarding, really. I suppose this raises it. But I mean, this is a team sport as much as anything else, isn't it? You've got to get it across all of the functions in the business, and certainly when we're doing social engineering training, we always say a little bit like I was saying to you earlier, James, about the comms team. Everyone needs to know their own team really well. Tying in with what Nia says about awareness, it's awareness of what's normal for other people. Difficult when we've all just changed to something that's absolutely not normal. Christian, baselines of behaviour, or knowing your people well when everyone's behaving strangely?
Yeah, for the people that you knew back pre-pandemic that you'd shared office time with, and kind of you've been involved in social situations, you've gone to events, etc. I think that's easy. But then you've got kind of the new teams, members that are joining us and are joining organizations through this whole pandemic. And you suddenly don't have a kind of onboarding process to support that. So one of the things we learned very quickly and had to move very quickly on responding to, because a lot of our ways of bringing people into the organization were, as probably most were, the traditional piece. So a turn up at a physical office address, bring this stuff with you, kind of we'll take photocopies of your ID documentation, right to works, we'll exchange those for laptops, etc., and kind of talk you through all of that process. All of a sudden, you've then got to try and deliver that same capability in a remote environment where your end user, your new member of staff, wants the kind of Apple out of the box experience where they just kind of glide through some options, input some data, and away they go. But trying to kind of engineer a response that kind of supports your business that perhaps isn't as kind of bleeding edge as Apple is. So that's been very difficult. And it's at what point do you kind of stop trusting your employees that they're not going to go rogue with access? But I think it's in that assessment of what's the worst that could happen. And I'm sure you've said this many times before, but to kind of catch a crook, you've got to think like one. So kind of in a way, in approach, you're dealing with the insider risks. It's actually, well, look, what would you do if you were suddenly one of the questions was around furlough employees, but if that was you putting that position, what's the worst that could happen? What are they going to be doing or have the potential to do to your organization?
Yeah, I mean, Nia, I know that you were saying yesterday that highlights the importance of it being a dynamic system, that baseline of behavior is a dynamic thing. Do you want to expand on that a little bit for the viewers today? Oh, you're on mute, Nia. There we go.
Quote of 2020.
Yes.
So, so it is dynamic, more so to say modular thing, and it's a matter of maturity. So I will explain that part. We can take one radical which states an organization without any identity provider, not even like the standard predicted Active Directory, Open LDAP or equivalent that organizations, even small organizations, implements. Then you can ask yourself, okay, assuming that I am this type of organization in that level of maturity, do I have any central identity provider, things like Okta, Auth0, or equivalent, at least for the on-prem area? Then you can ask yourself, okay, are systems connected to that? Not only corporate systems, but also other systems which also holds a lot of, let's say, very sensitive assets. It could be sensitive data or sensitive operations that could be executed through the system, etc. And moving forward, it could be things like, okay, do I have something for my SaaS providers so I can integrate them with my central identity providing? And if you would like to go to the other radical that I started with, you can find an organization that have both the on-prem systems in like private clouds, public clouds, corporate SaaS providers which support central identity providers, and also obsolete SaaS providers which the organization work with them and doesn't support that integration. But for all use cases, you could find potential solution. I don't think we can expand enough and that we have enough time for today to expand for each and every solution. I just want to mention that for all of the cases, maybe excluding the last one that I've mentioned with SaaS providers, which doesn't support any central identity providing, all of the other cases considered as pretty trivial to integrate and to implement. It might be a bit tricky when it comes to football club or any other food and beverage companies, which are not necessarily dealing with these things on a day-to-day.
Right. Yeah, I think you make really good points, Nia, about the kind of the industry and the level of risk that they need to respond to, and indeed, how used they get to dealing with these types of risks. I think we should look so a couple of our questions now, and maybe if I come to this first one, which is from Dave, and he said automation of on and offboarding and associated system provisioning, deprovisioning is desirable and difficult in equal measures. Any tips for achieving it? What about automation, James? And anything to comment on that question of Dave's?
I mean, automation, I think for onboarding, offboarding process, yes, basically where you can. It helps. It is a significant benefit, will provide significant benefit. I know Nia has lots of thoughts on this, and I totally agree with him. I think you also need to have the checks and balances in place to ensure that it does actually work. So don't trust it. Have secondary checks to ensure that actually the right stuff's taking place. Depending on what you're trying to onboard and offboard, there is always going to be challenges, and it's good to look out to the market and see what other people are doing. Don't reinvent the wheel, basically. And the use of I suppose generic automation is often beneficial where you're having to join systems together.
I mean, I would always say the automation's not going to cover everything. And I suppose if we get to Mark D-Love's question here, which is about you should instigate leavers processes, line managers or HR, how do you manage disabling of accounts in a timely fashion, not have any gaps? I mean, the automation
it needs to sit on top of it, yeah. So, and again, I know Nia has a lot of thought on this, but you have to get you have to get the underlying processes, the policies, any of the workflow in absolutely nailed. Basically, get the basics right, and then from there you expand out with the technology and the automation. If the basics don't work, then what are you going to automate anyway? So you need to have those manual processes in place, and the automation actually takes those and does something with the technology, but the underlying basics are absolutely essential.
Nia, you'd agree, I guess.
Yeah. What I would like to add on top of that, as James already referred, automation is the only way for the long term to keep it sustainable. Because with manual operations, you have a lot of place for human errors and for other issues and problems that might occur and are occurring in practice. So when I'm saying automation, that's, I would say, 50% of effective how for that implementation. The other 50%, which I gotta mention now, is having one single source of truth for either onboarding or offboarding. And it's easy to say, oh yeah, of course, let's go with HR systems. In some cases, it works. In some other cases, the HR systems by themselves are suffering from some misalignments on what does it mean or what is the definition of order. Is a new employee, maybe it's a new contractor, which is not an employee, which wouldn't be covered by that system, and so many other edge cases which are aggregated to be not an edge cases anymore in that regards, which makes it much more tricky. So to sum it up, having full automation without any compromising and having one effective single source of truth should be the best recipe for success.
Thanks, Nia. Christian.
Sorry, I think that's a great technology solution, but I think for us, for me, I'm going to have to go down a hybrid route. I think if we were to fully automate both the kind of the incoming and outgoing kind of employee touch points, it would really go against a lot of our culture and sort of purpose as a business. We're not that technology orientated that it almost then becomes faceless. So I know part of our attraction, part of our kind of our magic is actually, look, we're a people business. And the idea is that, look, we don't want people just to have a screen experience of automated sort of bells and whistles just to get kind of account provisioning. Now, there will be some automation in there to kind of sort of deal with a lot of that. But actually for us, it's more about kind of that employee experience, because we want them to feel part of the organization, part of the team, whether they land in a legal role or a business operations role. And the same way for them leaving. Yes, there'll be automation to a point, because we'll want to shut down some access or kind of put them on monitored duties. If they're a high-risk candidate, we may move them into a particular process. But actually, for us, because of who we are, we feel that actually we still want to put people in there. But to the point that James made and Nia made around the processes and ensuring it all works is absolutely vital. But for us, I don't think full automation is the answer.
I took Nia's point to mean more along the lines of the automation kind of does the heavy lifting, because if you look at this, I just visioned this guy, our food salesman or hot dog salesman or whatever at the soccer game. I mean, it feels to me as if they just forgot to cancel that password. Once the automation, that's what you get. I feel like that's what you're telling me, is the automation would stop that. But I am so obviously on Christian's team, as it were, in terms of, because we deal with so many insider threats, and it's that humans, a machine is never going to look at a human and realize how angry they are. And you might tell me the facial recognition and all those types of things are coming in, but when we interview people when they're going out, when line managers know that someone's, you know, have personal issues or health issues, or particular issues with the company, has got an axe to grind, that part of the offboarding process, I don't think you can replace it with the machine. I think they do the heavy lifting, so the humans only need to focus on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just on a pure kind of management of identities, access and privileges through your organization. Yeah, as soon as you know something's not quite right, that should kind of cut out or reduce down until you've got an opportunity to understand what action needs to be taken. And I think it's going to be very real for us, and we'll see more of these cases coming about. I think Gartner have predicted that by 2023, 75% of cloud security failures are going to be a direct result from mismanagement of identity, access, and privilege. So it's kind of, it's not just us saying this; it's actually kind of it's out there. I'm sure it'll bear a whole new load of acronyms and kind of snack oil for people to kind of buy into, but fundamentally it's management of that access.
I mean, absolutely. Our survey that we've already put in the chat from testing, they said they investigated and they said insider threat incidents or incidents related to insider threat had increased by 47% over 2019 and 2020. The survey came out in December 2020. I mean, it's still a huge problem. I wonder if with that remote workforce, the vast majority of these incidents, the vast majority are negligent insiders. It's not malice. And that remote working model just made it so much more easy to be negligent, to make mistakes, didn't it? I don't know. Do you think we're going to be able to fix that easily in the future? Because we're a year in now. I feel like we can't keep blaming the pandemic. We're a year in. Nia, what do you think? Let's go to Nia first, then to James, maybe come to Christian in a minute.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, if I would take the example of, you know, the food and beverage company, the incident that you've introduced, I think that same incident and the same probability that it would happen would be similar if we wouldn't have the COVID era and we wouldn't go work from home, you know, so much, because this is mainly due to a vulnerability or an exposure which caused by a human knowing his credentials and can take them with him, you know, about the offboarding processes and other controls which didn't really work in that regards. But more concretely, if I would need to think which types of risks are going to be higher mainly or directly because of the new era, I would say that it's mainly data exfiltrations and things like that when it comes to laptops and non-bring-your-own-device types of machines. Because think about a mobile device, which are made, in most of the cases, are more manageable when it comes to MDM implementations and other solutions in that sphere. But when it comes to the traditional part, when you have a laptop as an employee, and you have a lot of local data, which is in most of the cases is either stored or cached, depends on the context. And then there is an offboarding process. And even if everything is being done according to what I've just mentioned, full automation and any other following processes, which, you know, make certain that everything is being done properly, still, if you still, as an employee, which is about to be offboarded, you have access to your machine, even if you don't have access to the services that you're allowed to connect or disallowed more, now you still have temporary access to potentially very sensitive data, which in some cases could be found on the storage, on the local storage. In more common cases, if you're a more advanced user, you can find the more sensitive data stored within your cache. And that could impose a very significant risk when an employee could just find a ways to exfiltrate that data either via USB device or any other form of communication, which are not necessarily blocked in the organization, mainly to Christian point, you know, organization would like to keep user experience good or at least reasonable because you can't block anything, which makes sense.
Because it's a cycle. Otherwise, people don't feel trusted, so they get annoyed, they get angry, and it just kind of adds to it. What was I going to say? I was going to switch to James next and just say, I'd imagine that a lot of processes and procedures, James, were very hastily revised over the last 12 months. Do you think most businesses are becoming more robust with this hybrid model by now, a year in?
I hope so. I think this is here to stay in one form or another. I think there will obviously be different appetites across different organisations, but this challenge and this way of working is something we need to expect and we need to persist. I think with regards to policies, processes, all that sort of stuff, I think it's a constant challenge. It should form part of everything that we do in terms of looking at it and making sure that actually what we have in place is appropriate. The changes we've made are reviewed regularly, and they are kept up to date, and basically just expect to be in this hybrid model going forward. I don't think it's going to revert back completely. And I think there is a need for organisations of all sizes, particularly smaller ones as well, to actually think about this and what that means to them from a risk point of view. I think having people working remotely, things that were pretty easy before have become slightly more challenging. So going back to the point Neil made around data exfiltration, we see a lot of challenges with people actually learning some of our processes simply because they're not shown in a way that they were shown traditionally, face to face. So validating understanding that the newly onboarded individuals actually understand the process and are actually doing it in the right way is essential. If you don't do that validation, how do you know? So where we had visibility previously, we need to change that. We need to replicate that in a way which allows it to take place whilst working from home or working remotely.
It's a difficult balance, Christian. Difficult balance.
Yeah, and I think that's to James's point. I think it varies from organisation to organisation. So, kind of, what do you need to do to kind of keep the lights on and the widgets kind of coming out of the machine to kind of support this? And I think it's been an absolute shockwave through many industries that perhaps have relied on presenteeism previously, and have kind of built their systems of control around a physical address. Kind of making sure that kind of only the kind of right people got in, people when they were in were kind of behaving in a kind of a secure way. I always remember back in, I think it was about April time last year, so mid kind of lockdown 1.0 here in the UK, we had a scheduled ISO 27001 audit to come in, and they were just blown away because it's like, well, how am I meant to kind of police this kind of clear desk policy that you've got? And I'm like, well, when you work it out, let us know. But for the time being, look, my desk at the back's lovely and clear. People needed to adjust quickly. And I think with the new different that we head to, people will do so as the same. From our insight and then kind of studies we've done with our own people, and sort of not studies as such, but kind of our Q&A is basically that we're seeing probably 5-6% of our people, they want to get back to that normal that was 5 days in the office. Again, the same kind of percentage of those that actually will quite happily now stay at home. And then a mixture in between that want to do the 2 to 3 days and kind of that hybrid working. So from a security position, we need to understand what those that risk exposure is, and actually where we've allowed people to print at home because they kind of needed to, because of the way that some of the courts operate in this land and abroad, they needed physical documentation. But how does that work if we're moving them back into a more traditional office setting where the MFPs are more centrally controlled? It's going to require a lot of agile thinking.
I agree, and I mean, I think just before I get you just final thoughts, let's just have a look at one or two of these questions and just let's see if we can answer them really quickly. One of the questions is really interesting, and it's almost a topic in itself, I think, for another show in the future. But what are people's thoughts on people who were furloughed and the risk from that? I mean, they couldn't work, but they still, I assume, had their hardware and their machines at home. And then a lot of people weren't happy with the sort of furlough model. I mean, Nia, have you any thoughts on that? They're still working for the company, but they're not supposed to work at all. Was the risk different for furloughed employees?
It depends. First of all, if we're talking about the hardware perspective, I think today in 2021, that's an easy thing to resolve, even in scale, when it comes to encryption controls and any other forms of control. which helps you to address this specific risk. When it comes to the new era, I think what's most significantly got changed is the fact that if yesterday, like a year ago, if you like, it was like, working from the office was like the mainstream, where working remotely was something to support, as an auxiliary kind of mindset.
Yeah.
Today, it's a bit, I don't want to say it's the other way around, because I don't think that the office is minimized. I think it's just about things are going towards remote working as a standard, as the mainstream, which I think today it's pretty much what it is. And with that, the industry, I think, is also following, the new risks, or not the new risks as much as the existing risk, which now became more and more high because of the probability, because of the common usage with remote access to systems, including SaaS and on-prem and the hybrid mode in some specific cases. And that brought the industry to a bit change and to adapt and to deliver and to go with their product roadmaps and other elements to go for solutions which are more adaptive for that new setup. Absolutely. And I think on the long term or even mid-term, we would see a lot of risk reduction in these spaces.
Absolutely. James, final thoughts. Thank you, Nir. Final thoughts.
I agree with Nir. It's all about the risk. So without sounding a little bit old-fashioned, people, process, technology, think about the risk, focus everything on what those risks are within the 3 different domains, and mitigate and react accordingly.
Christian, would you agree with James?
No, just to be difficult. Of course I do. Yeah, so look, picking up the fundamentals is going to be key. The PPTs, or kind of however you address them in your organization. I think there's a real opportunity to show how security teams, functions can really enable the business now in this new different that we're going to go back to.
Yeah.
Imagine if you can position yourself to show a secure remote working capability that allows the teams to do what they need to do with the information they need at the right time, regardless of where they are, on the off chance that kind of you can then show that, if the facilities team need to reevaluate the real estate of offices that you've got or reduce the printing capacity at home, well, look, business case there, how security is saving the business money or supporting that strategy. I just think this opportunity now is too good to pass, too good to kind of miss out on. And I think if we don't do it now, we're going to be left behind.
Yeah, totally agree.
Absolutely. Well, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure hearing everybody's thoughts on this today. I want to say thanks to everyone in the chat. For me, there's a clear winner in terms of the questions, but let's just see if our Thais elves agree over on the right. But for now, I mean, I'd sort of finish with, there's a saying that I love, and we talk about it when I do social engineering and when we do infiltration, which is we say laws are absent in wartime. And I sometimes think that's going to be the case both for the people attacking us, for insider threats and everything else. I think you've shed some light on what we might be able to do to address that. So I just want to say thank you so much to my amazing panel today. I thought it was a fabulous discussion, guys. Thanks so much to Christian Toon, to Nir Schiavone, and to James Hammond. I want to say thank you so much to all of our audience for participating in the show and asking so many great questions and chatting with us. And I want to say thank you to the Thais elves who perform their tasks so diligently. We will let whoever it is who has won the Thais mug know very shortly. But for now, thanks to everyone for joining me on another episode of teissTalk.